The clock in the vicarage hall had just struck 2. Rain moved through the churchyard in slow, patient sheets, and the yew trees dripped onto the graves of parishioners the reverend had buried himself. Inside the study, a single candle guttered on the writing desk, and the parson bent over a letter he would never finish. The ink was still wet on the word Frimley. Outside, boots pressed into the wet gravel of the drive. 2 men, hoods drawn low against the September rain, paused at the door. One carried a short pistol beneath his coat. The other held a length of cord. The reverend did not look up. He heard only the small sounds of a country night, the rain, the tick of the clock, the settling of coals. And then the door gave way. The Quiet Parish. Good evening and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Wherever you are listening from, and whatever hour has found you tonight, I am glad of your company. If it is late where you are, and the house has settled around you, and the last car has gone by on the road outside, then you are in the right place. Let the blanket be heavy. Let the light be low. Let the tea, if you have made one, go cold on the table beside you. It does not matter now. Before we begin, I would ask a small kindness. If you find these long, slow histories a help against the dark hours, subscribe to the Bedside Historian and give the video a gentle push where the buttons live. It costs you nothing, and it lets me keep bringing you these hours out of the archive. Tell me too, in a word or two before you drift, where in the world you are listening from, and what the clock says on your side of the night. I like to know. It makes the room feel less empty on my end as well. And now, as the rain begins somewhere in the century behind us, let us drift backward together. The year is 1850. The month is September, and it is drawing to its close. If you had walked, in that autumn, out of the coaching yard at Guildford, and taken the London road for 4 or 5 miles, and then turned off at the finger post that pointed toward the Heath, you would have come, in the end, to the parish of Frimley. It sat on the northwest edge of the county of Surrey, hard against the border of Hampshire, in a stretch of country that most travellers passed through without ever meaning to stop. The land there was poor. The soil was thin, and the sand ran close under the grass, and the wide commons were given over to gorse and heather, and to the sheep that could find a living where the plough could not. In summer, the heath took on a purple that pilgrims from London sometimes remarked upon, and in winter it went the colour of iron. That September, at the tail of a wet month, it was somewhere between the two. The village itself was a small one. There were, by the parish clerk's reckoning of the year before, a little over 1,100 souls counted within its bounds, and most of them were labourers who worked the surrounding farms, or worked in the brickfields that had opened along the London road, or worked, when the pay was better, on the ranges of the great army camp being cut out of the heath at Aldershot a few miles to the west. Everyone in Frimley had a cousin or a brother-in-law up at the works. Everyone had heard, on a still evening, the distant crack of drill fire carried across the gorse. It was, in that sense, no longer the drowsy village it had been in the reign of the last king. Change had begun to move over it, the way rain moves over a heath, at first only a darkening in the air. But the heart of the place, the part that a man would think of if you spoke the name Frimley to him in a London street, was still the church and the vicarage and the lane that ran between them. The church was old. A part of its fabric went back to the years when the Norman lords still held these hundreds, and the tower, squat and square and settled deep into the ground, had watched over the burying of parishioners for longer than any man in the village could count. Around it lay the churchyard, and around the churchyard stood the yews. There were, at that date, 4 great yews near the porch, and any villager could tell you that they had been full grown when his grandfather had been christened under them. In the wet weather they dripped for a long time after the rain had stopped, and their shadows fell heavy on the stones beneath. Just beyond the churchyard wall, along a short gravel drive lined with laurels, stood the vicarage. It was a plain house of the sort a country parson could expect in a modest Surrey living, 2 stories of brick under a slate roof, a small stable and coach house at the side, a walled kitchen garden at the back, and a lawn in front that ran down to the low wall separating the drive from the churchyard. The windows on the ground floor were tall, and the front door was set beneath a shallow porch with 2 stone steps worn slightly hollow by parish feet. From the upper windows, in daylight, you could see the top of the church tower and the tops of the yews beyond it, and here, if the wind was in the right quarter, the bell rung for the hour. The man who lived in that house, and who would not live in it much longer, was the Reverend George Edward Hollist. He was, at the time of our story, in his 50th year. He had been vicar of Frimley for nearly a decade, and before that he had held other cures in the county, and before that he had read for holy orders at Oxford, in the middle years of the last reign, when the church was still a settled career for the son of a gentleman of modest means. His father had been a naval officer, and there was, if the villagers had asked him, a family connection to a bishop and to a general, and a memorial or two in cathedrals further west. He did not speak of it often. He was not a proud man, though he was a particular one, and he kept the small pride of the country parson in his books and his linen and the tidiness of his study. Physically, the Reverend was of middling height, a little stout in the way of a man who spent his days between a desk and a pulpit, with a full round face that had grown ruddy in the sun of a wet English summer. His hair was grey, and he wore it swept back from a broad forehead. He had the reading glasses of a man who preferred to work by candlelight even at noon. His voice, from the pulpit, was said to be pleasant rather than powerful, and he preached the sort of sermon that comforted farmers and their wives more than it stirred them. He had never sought a larger living. He had a wife he loved, and a house he liked, and a garden that consented, in most years, to give him roses. His wife, Caroline, was a good deal younger than he was. She was a clergyman's daughter herself, brought up in a rectory not many miles off, and she had come to Frimley as a bride in the earlier years of the marriage. She kept the household in the manner of her class and her time, the kitchen ordered, the linen counted, the accounts written up in a small ledger on the parlour table, the servants known by name and by disposition. She was slight, dark-haired, and quick in her movements, and the villagers who saw her in the churchyard on a Sunday morning would tell you that the parson had married a kind woman. She and the Reverend had no children of their own. In the vicarage, at that date, they kept in addition to themselves a cook, 2 housemaids, and a manservant who slept over the coach house, and there was, from time to time, a curate's family or a visiting cousin in one of the upstairs rooms. The house was not large, but it was full. The parson's day, in that late summer, ran to a pattern that hardly varied. He rose before the household and read his prayers alone in the study while the maid laid the fire. He took his breakfast with his wife at 8:30. He walked, if the weather allowed, up the lane to the church and back again by way of the schoolhouse, where he liked to look in on the master and the children at their lessons. In the afternoons he wrote or read or made his visits to a sick weaver at the far edge of the parish, to a widow whose husband he had buried the year before, to the farm at Frimley Green, where the eldest son had just come home from soldiering. Once a week, on a Tuesday, he rode into Guildford on his little grey mare to see his bank and his tailor and to take his tea with a fellow clergyman near the castle. In the evenings, when the household had eaten and the maids had gone up, he sat in his study with a candle and his letters, and worked at his correspondence until the clock in the hall struck 11, and sometimes later. He was, in short, exactly the kind of Church of England parson whom the novels of that decade were fond of describing: mild, learned in a modest way, more useful than distinguished, more loved than admired. He had a small library of theology and a rather better one of natural history. He knew the birds of the heath and the grasses and the names of the wild flowers in Latin as well as in English. He kept a pair of spaniels that lay under his desk when he worked. He kept, in the drawer of that same desk, a locked case of family silver, a coffee pot, a milk jug, a small chased salver, and a set of teaspoons with his mother's monogram engraved upon the handles. It was not a great treasure. It was, by the standards of a London house, almost nothing. In the tap-room of a beer shop on Guildford Heath, however, spoken of by a maid on her afternoon out, and heard by the wrong ears, It could be made to sound like the fortune of a king. We shall come back, in time, to those tap rooms and to those ears. For now, let it be enough that the parson of Frimley did not think of himself as a wealthy man, and did not lock his silver away in any strong room, and slept in an upstairs bedchamber with his wife, with only the thin bolt of the front door and the goodwill of the parish between him and the road. Because the road, in that autumn of 1850, was busier than it had been in living memory. I have to leave the study for a moment and take you out to the lane beyond the churchyard wall, because the lane is part of the story as much as the house is. It ran, that road, more or less east and west across the parish, and it carried, in the course of an ordinary day, the traffic of a country in the middle of a change it did not yet have a name for. There were the farm carts, of course, coming down from the higher ground with their loads of turnips and of straw. There were the drovers with their small dark cattle bound for the Guildford market on the Tuesday and the Croydon market on the Saturday. There were the higglers with their baskets of eggs and butter. There were the tramping men, some of them old soldiers of the last war, going from parish to parish for a night's work and a night's shelter, of whom the parson's kitchen fed a fair number in the course of a year. But there were also, now, the navvies. There were the brick carters coming down from the new works along the London road, with the red dust on their coats and the red dust in the sweat of their horses. There were the labouring gangs going up to the ranges at Aldershot and coming back down when the pay was gone. There were young men out of the London slums who had walked into Surrey looking for work on the railway cuttings and had not found it, and had come to sit on the parish benches and drink up the last of their shillings in the beer shops between Guildford and Bagshot. Every parish along that line of country had, by the autumn of that year, its little population of men who had come from somewhere else and had nowhere in particular to go. The record does not always tell us their names. The parish registers of the beer shops, if there had ever been such a thing, are lost to us. But the constable's books tell us that petty theft along that road had risen sharply in the 12 months before our story begins, and that, in the tap rooms of Guildford Heath, the talk had begun to turn, more often than it used to, toward the houses of the clergy and the small gentry, and what might be found in them by a determined man on a wet night. The reverend, of course, knew a little of this. He was not a fool. He read his Times when it came down from London on the coach, and he heard from his brother clergy at their monthly meeting, and he knew that a curate near Woking had been robbed of his watch on the highway not 6 months before. He had been advised more than once to keep a firearm in the house. He had declined. He had said, more than once, that a clergyman who slept with a pistol under his pillow had lost the plot of his own vocation. He said it with a smile. He said it the way a man says a thing he has thought about, and thought about again, and settled. Whether he was right to settle it in that way is not for us to say from this distance. It is hard to imagine, though, that he did not, in the last week of his life, hear the rain on the roof of an evening and wonder for a moment whether he had chosen well. We do not know what Caroline thought of this. The sources are quiet on that point. She was not a woman given to writing down her fears, and if she pressed her husband on the matter of a pistol or a bolt or a heavier lock, the parish record does not preserve it. She kept the household. She said her prayers. She trusted, as women of her class and her faith were taught to trust, that a house with a clergyman in it was in some way under a protection stronger than any lock. That trust would be tested, in the small hours of a wet Friday morning, more cruelly than she could have imagined on the still Sunday afternoons she remembered from her girlhood. For now, though, in the last week of September of 1850, none of that had happened yet. The rooks came home to the Yews at dusk in the way they always had. The bell was rung for the hour by the same old sexton who had rung it for the reverend's predecessor. The candle was lit on the study desk at 6:30, and the parson bent over his letters, and the fire in the grate settled to a soft red. In the kitchen, the cook covered the bread with a cloth. In the yard, the manservant drew the bolt on the coach-house door and went up the wooden stair to his bed above the horses. In the churchyard, the Yews dripped a little longer after the rain had stopped, as they always did. And along the road a few miles off, In a beer shop on the edge of the Heath, 3 men sat over a table with the wet still on their coats and lowered their voices and began to speak of the parson of Frimley and of what he might have inside his house. The Vicarage by the Yews. Come with me now, if you will, up the gravel drive between the laurels. The rain has held off for the moment, and it is early in the last week of September, and the light of a Surrey afternoon lies thin and grey across the front of the house. I want you to see it while it is still standing whole. There is a story coming that will crack it open from the ground floor up, and once that has happened it is hard, ever after, to remember the vicarage as it was on an ordinary day. 2 stone steps rise to the front porch. They have been walked on for the better part of a century, and the middle of each one is worn a little hollow, so that a woman in the wet season has to lift her skirts a fraction to keep them out of the puddle that gathers in the dip. The porch itself is shallow, hardly deeper than a man's arm, with a lamp on an iron hook above the door and a bench of dark oak set against the wall for parish visitors who do not choose to come inside. The door is of the same dark oak. It has a brass knocker in the shape of a hand holding a ring, and a bell pull to the right for those who prefer not to be heard hammering. Above the door, a fanlight of 6 clear panes lets a little of the hall light spill out onto the gravel at night. Inside the front door, the hall runs the depth of the house, floored in flagstones scrubbed once a week by the younger of the 2 housemaids, and covered down its centre by a long strip of drugget in a faded red pattern. The walls are papered in a colour that a London draper would have called stone, and hung with 3 prints, an engraving of Winchester Cathedral, a coloured plate of Surrey birds, and a portrait of the reverend's father in his naval uniform, done from life when the old man was a lieutenant. A tall clock in a mahogany case stands against the wall between the parlour door and the dining-room door, and its pendulum, brass and unhurried, keeps the pulse of the whole house. On the hall table beside the door lies a salver for calling cards. It is not the salver from the study drawer. This one is plated and worth almost nothing to a man with a sack. To your right as you come in is the parlour, and it is here that Caroline, the reverend's wife, receives most of the parish. It is not a grand room. The ceiling is low enough that a tall visitor is minded to stoop under the doorway, and the fireplace is of the plain white marble of the earlier reign, with a coal grate polished each morning with a lead paste that leaves the housemaid's fingers black until dinner. 2 armchairs in a green figured cloth face the fire, with a low table between them for the tea things. Against the far wall stands an upright piano, a Broadwood of some age, on which Caroline plays hymns on a Sunday evening and, on weekdays, works her way through a book of Irish airs that she brought from her father's house when she married. There is a work table by the window where her needlework lives, and a canary in a brass cage that whistles when the sun is on the panes and sulks when it is not. The record does not tell us the canary's name. It tells us only that Caroline was fond of it, and that after the events we shall come to it was given to a cousin at Farnham, and lived out its span there. Across the hall from the parlour is the dining-room. It is more modest than a stranger would expect, given the size of the household, because the parson does not entertain in the manner of the county gentry. A round table of dark walnut sits in the middle, spread on this September afternoon with a cloth of coarse white linen and a set of everyday plates in a blue willow pattern. 6 chairs stand around it, matched, and a 7th, higher-backed and clearly older, is drawn up close to the sideboard for the reverend's own use. On the sideboard itself stand the visible pieces of the household plate, a plated coffee pot for morning use, 2 decanters in cut glass, and a wooden tea caddy with a brass lock, of which Caroline keeps the key on a chain at her waist. The true silver, the mother's monogrammed pieces, is not out on view. It lives, as we heard last hour, in the locked case in the study drawer, 3 rooms away. Behind the dining room, reached through a swing door bound in green baize, are the offices of the house. This is where the working life of the vicarage is carried on, and it is where the 4 servants spend most of their waking hours. There is the kitchen, with a heavy range that the cook, a woman of about 45 whose name in the census is written as Sarah, black leads every Saturday afternoon, and whose iron doors carry the dents of 10 years of poker work. A copper is set in the far corner for the washing of linen, and the flagged floor stays cold through August. A dresser along one wall holds the everyday china, hung and stacked on its shelves, and above it, on nails, a row of copper pans in decreasing size, kept bright by the younger maid on her Thursday mornings. Beside the range, a low wooden chair with a cushion of faded ticking is set for the cook's brief sittings between one task and the next. Off the kitchen there is a scullery, where the washing up is done in a shallow wooden trough lined with lead, and a pantry, cool and windowless, where the bread, the cheese, the pickled eggs, and the earthenware jars of preserved plum from last summer's tree are kept on slate shelves. There is a back door to the yard, bolted top and bottom, through which the milk boy comes in the mornings, and the tramping men come in the evenings for their bread and their small beer at the kitchen table. Beyond the yard, and I will take you out in a moment, are the coach house and the garden. First, though, let us go back through the baize door and up the stair. The main staircase rises out of the hall opposite the front door, a straight run of 14 shallow steps in oak, with a plain turned banister on a white painted spindle. It is not a stair built for show. The reverend's father, had he lived to see it, might have shaken his head at how little his son had chosen to spend on the fabric of a country house. But it holds a footstep well, and it does not creak, which will matter more than any of them can guess in the small hours of a Friday morning. At the top of the stair, a short landing opens onto 4 doors. The largest, on the front of the house, is the master bedchamber. It is a plain room, papered in a pattern of faint blue flowers that Caroline chose when they came to the parish, with a 4-post bed of dark wood, unhung by curtains because the reverend cannot bear the closeness of them, and a washstand in the corner, with a jug and basin of white china, figured with a border of ivy. A coal fire is lit in the grate on the coldest evenings only. A dressing table stands under the window with Caroline's few pieces of jewellery in a shallow ebony box, and a hairbrush of tortoiseshell, and a silver-backed hand mirror that came to her from her grandmother. There is a chest of drawers against the far wall, and above it, tacked to the paper, a print of the Good Shepherd that has hung there since the year of their marriage. Across the landing from the master bedchamber is the guest room, empty on this particular week, its bed made up under a white counterpane, and its curtains drawn against the light. Beyond that, a narrower door leads to what Caroline calls the sewing room, where the household mending is done, and where, in winter, the reverend's clerical bands are pressed and starched on a table by the window. The 4th door, narrower again, opens onto the servants' stair. I want you to take a moment on that stair with me. It is important, and it will be important again before the story ends. It is a plain wooden stair, unpainted, its treads worn pale down the middle from years of feet in heavy shoes. It runs from the landing outside the sewing room down to a passage behind the kitchen, so that the maids can move about the house without crossing the hall or the master's rooms. It also rises from the same landing to a second flight, narrower still, that leads to the 2 garret rooms under the slate roof. In the front garret sleeps Caroline's own maid, a young woman of about 20 from a village near Farnham. In the back garret sleep the 2 housemaids, in a shared bed with an iron frame and a mattress of horsehair. There is 1 narrow window in each garret, set into the roof at shoulder height. From the front one, on a clear morning, you can see the top of the church tower and the crowns of the yews. From the back one, you can see the roof of the coach house, and, beyond it, the wall of the kitchen garden and the empty field that runs down to the lane. Come back down with me now. Come down the main stair this time, and turn left along the hall, past the tall clock, to the door at the far end. This is the study, and this is the room in which most of what is coming will begin. The door is of the same dark oak as the front door, and it fits its frame close enough that a draught in the hall does not disturb the candle inside. Push it open. The room is perhaps 15 feet by 12, with 1 tall window looking out onto the side of the house and the laurel hedge beyond, and a fireplace on the inner wall with a brass fender polished by the housemaid on her Wednesday round. The floor is boarded and covered by a turkey rug, faded to the colour of dry leaves along its centre where the reverend's chair has stood these 10 years. The desk is set with its long side to the window, so that the reverend writes with the light on his left hand in the morning and by a single candle in the evening. It is a heavy piece of mahogany, with 3 drawers on each side of the knee-hole and a shallow drawer above. The shallow drawer holds his pens, his ink, a stick of red sealing wax and a brass seal cut with a wheat sheaf, and a penknife with a bone handle for the mending of quills. The lower drawer on the right, deeper than the others, holds his correspondence of the current year, in bundles tied with black tape. The lower drawer on the left holds the case of family silver. The case is of dark leather, and it fits close inside the drawer, and the key to it hangs on a hook screwed into the underside of the desk, where a man sitting at it can reach it without rising. Around the walls of the study stand the bookshelves. On the wall behind the desk are the theology and the sermons of a working parson, a bound run of a quarterly review from the middle years of the last reign, a modest set of the Fathers in translation, a Hebrew grammar he no longer opens, and the parish registers of Frimley, bound in vellum for the years of his own incumbency. On the wall opposite, and this is the shelf he loves best, are the volumes of natural history, a coloured folio of British birds, a run of Loudon on gardening, 3 thick books on the wildflowers of the southern counties, and, on the bottom shelf where he can reach it from his chair, a much-thumbed copy of White's Selborne, which he has read every winter of his adult life. The 2 spaniels, at this hour of the afternoon, are asleep on the rug beneath the desk, one at each of the reverend's feet. Their names, in the parish accounts of the year before, are given as Bess and Juno. Whether the reverend spoke to them under his breath while he wrote, and whether they lifted their heads when Boots passed in the drive outside, is not written down anywhere, and I will not pretend for you that it is. There is more of the house I could walk you through, the coach-house across the yard, with the little grey mare in her stall, and the manservant's bed above her under the tiled roof, the walled garden at the back, with the espalier pears going brown at the tips, and the last of the runner beans on their canes, the row of beehives against the south wall from which the parson takes a modest crop of honey each August. But the light is beginning to go, and the rain is coming back across the heath from the west, and I would rather leave you inside the study for the moment, with the fire settled and the candle lit, and the 2 dogs asleep under the desk, so that you can hold the room in your mind as it was. Before we close the door on the vicarage, I want you to fix 3 things in your memory. Fix the front porch with its 2 hollowed steps and its shallow bench, because a man will stand on those steps in the small hours of a Friday morning who has no business there. Fix the servants' stair, unpainted and worn pale, because a young woman will run down it in her nightgown, with a candle in her hand and a cry building in her throat. And fix the study, and the desk, and the lower left drawer, and the leather case inside it, because it is for the sake of what lies in that drawer, and for almost no other reason under heaven, that 4 lives will come apart along the road from Guildford. The candle on the desk was lit at 6:30, in the ordinary way. Sarah covered the bread in the kitchen. The manservant drew the bolt on the coach-house door. The rooks came home to the Yews. And along the lane, 4 or 5 miles off, on the edge of the wet heath, 3 men were already sitting over a table with their heads together and their voices low, and the first sketch of a plan beginning to move between them like the shadow of a hand across a wall. The roads from Guildford. Let me leave the vicarage behind now and take you west along the lane. The rain has begun again in earnest, and the wheels of the last farm cart have gone by, and there is nothing on the road for a mile in either direction but the wet gravel and the black hedges and the smell of the drenched heather coming off the common. This is the country the parson lives in. It is also, and we have to face it now, the country in which 3 other men are moving tonight. We will not meet them yet at the vicarage door. We will meet them first in the places they came from, so that when they arrive on the gravel drive between the laurels you will know who they are. The road we are on runs west out of the parish, past a scatter of cottages, and a brickfield with its kiln smoke laid low by the weather, and then it climbs a little onto the open heath. 4 miles further on, at the end of a long descent through beech woods, it enters the town of Guildford. Guildford, in that autumn of 1850, was the county town of Surrey, with a high street of old houses climbing steeply toward the ruins of the Norman castle, a bridge over the River Wey, and a marketplace where the corn was still sold in sacks under a wooden penthouse. It had, by the census of the year before, a little over 6,000 souls counted within the borough, and it had, beyond the borough boundary, a great many more who were not counted at all, navvies in the cottage rows above the wharves, tramping men in the yards of the coaching inns, and the drifting labour of the surrounding parishes come in for the Tuesday market, or the hiring fair or the paying off day at the brickfields. Guildford was, in short, a town with a firm respectable core and a broken outer edge, and it was on that outer edge that our 3 men lived their lives. Take the road north out of the town, past the barracks and out onto the higher ground where the heath opens up again, and within 2 or 3 miles you will come to a scatter of lonely beer shops, set back from the road at the mouths of muddy lanes. They were not inns. An inn kept beds and stabling, and a licence to sell spirits. These were meaner places, single rooms most of them, with a bench along one wall and a fire in the middle, and a barrel of small beer set on trestles at the back. A woman in a stained apron drew the beer, and a labourer who could not walk any further sat with his back to the wall until his money was gone. Some of them had no name painted on the door. The parish overseers knew where they were. The county magistrates knew where they were. On a wet September night, the constable of the district knew that if he wanted to find a particular kind of man, he had only to walk into one of them and stand in the doorway with his lantern up. It was in a shop of that sort, on the edge of the heath between Guildford and Bagshot, that Levi Harwood was sitting on the evening before our story begins. Levi Harwood was, at that date, in his 26th year. He had been born in a labourer's cottage a few miles west of Guildford, into a family whose name was already well known to the county bench. His father had been transported for sheep stealing when Levi was a boy of 9. 2 of his uncles were in the county gaol at the time we are speaking of, one for poaching and one for a burglary at a farmhouse near Godalming that had turned, when the master of the house woke up, into something worse. A cousin of his, older by a few years, had been hanged at Horsemonger Lane in London for a killing on the road to Reigate in the year of the young Queen's coronation. The Harwoods were, in the phrase the parish clerks used, a bad family. It was not a phrase the parish clerks used lightly. It meant that when a barn burned along that stretch of the heath, or a pig went missing from a cottage yard, the constable's first thought was of one of the Harwoods, and his second thought was of a Harwood-in-law, and only after that did he begin to look further afield. Levi himself was, in the flesh, a smaller man than his reputation. He stood a little under 5 feet and 7 inches, with dark hair worn long over his collar, and a thin face already lined about the mouth from 20 years of outdoor work. He had, since the age of 12, done every kind of labour a man of his class in that country could do. He had cut turf on the common. He had loaded bricks at the works along the London road. He had gone as a hireling to the harvest in the Weald, and been paid off in the last week of August. Between times, and increasingly of late, he had done other things for his money, of which the parish records give us only the outlines, and the beer shop keepers gave us nothing at all. He had been up before the bench, at Guildford, 4 times before the events we are moving toward. Twice the case had been dismissed. Once he had been given a month in the House of Correction. Once he had been fined a sum he did not pay, and he had been made to sit in the stocks in the town square for an afternoon, which had done nothing at all to soften his opinion of the town or its magistrates. Beside him at the table that evening sat his cousin, Samuel Harwood. Samuel was older than Levi by about 6 years, and he was a heavier, slower man in every respect. He worked, when he worked, in the brickfields, and his hands were red to the wrist and cracked across the knuckles from the wet clay. He had a wife somewhere near Ash, and 2 young children he did not always live with. He drank more than Levi did, and he thought more slowly, and he had the sort of temper that stayed banked in his chest for hours at a time and then flared without any warning that anyone could see. The record does not tell us what Samuel and Levi spoke of most nights. It tells us only that they were often in the same beer shops, and that when Levi wanted a second pair of hands for a piece of work he did not want to speak of aloud, Samuel was usually the first pair of hands he thought of. The third man at the table that evening was not a Harwood. His name was James Jones, and he was perhaps a year or two younger than Levi. He had come into Surrey from somewhere further west, out of one of the Welsh border counties by his own account, though the parish overseers were never sure whether to believe him about that or about anything else. He was slight of build, with reddish hair and a way of laughing at the end of his sentences that made men who did not know him well take him for a good-natured fool. He was neither. He had come to the county looking for work on the railway cuttings a year or two before, had failed to find any that suited him, and had drifted from lodging to lodging along the edge of the Heath ever since. He slept, in that last week of September, in a loft above a cart shed on a farm near Ash, where the farmer had let him in on the understanding that he would be gone before Michaelmas. The three of them then, on that Thursday evening, Levi Harwood, his cousin Samuel, and Jones, sat over a table in a beer shop whose exact name is not preserved in any document I have been able to find. It was somewhere on the road between Guildford and Bagshot. It was, from the descriptions given by other witnesses later, a low room with a single window of thick greenish glass, a floor of beaten earth, and a fire of turf and dross coal that smoked more than it warmed. The woman who kept it drew the beer and did not listen. She had learned long since not to listen. It was safer, on that road, not to remember what men said at your tables. I want to be careful here about what we can know and what we cannot. The court would eventually be told, by a witness who had been in that room, some of what was said that night. The witness's memory was patchy, and his motives in speaking were not the purest. What comes down to us, once you sift the trial reports, is roughly this. The talk began, as talk in those places usually began, with the price of labour and the meanness of the last farmer they had worked for. It moved, as such talk often moved, to houses along the roads they knew. It moved from those houses to the parsons and the country gentlemen who lived in them, and from there to the plate that such men were rumoured to keep in their sideboards and their studies. And at some point in the course of the evening, and no witness could ever say exactly when, the name of the vicarage at Frimley was spoken across the table for the first time. We do not know who spoke it first. Levi later said one thing about that, and Jones later said another, and the truth of it lies somewhere in the smoke of a room that no longer stands. What we do know is that all three of them had heard, from one source or another, that the parson at Frimley kept a case of family silver in his study, and that he lived in a plain brick house with no dog worth speaking of, and no man in it younger than himself. A housemaid on her afternoon out had spoken of it to a cousin in Guildford. The cousin had spoken of it in a taproom. The taproom had done what taprooms do. By the last week of September, the story had travelled the 4 or 5 miles up the road, and had reached the ears of men who were listening for exactly that kind of story. There is a thing that has to be said here, and I would rather say it plainly. These were not clever men. They were not planners in any sense that a novelist would use the word. They were 3 labourers at the far end of a long wet season, with the harvest paid off and the winter coming, and the brickfields already talking of laying men down. They had, between the 3 of them, a few shillings on the table, and no proper coats, and no clear notion of what a house like the Vicarage would actually hold when they got inside it. What they had, that night, was a story about a parson's silver, and the beer to make the story sound like a plan, and a willingness in each of them to do things they would not have done sober or in daylight. That is almost always how these nights begin. The court, when it came to sit in judgment on them, would speak of premeditation and of a conspiracy formed with malice. The court had to. The law required the word. But if you had stood in the doorway of that beer shop on the Thursday evening and listened for half an hour, you would not have heard a conspiracy. You would have heard 3 tired men getting drunk, and one of them saying, more than once, that a country parson was a soft mark for a man with the courage to try him. They did not settle it that night. They did not need to. They settled the shape of it, the parson, the study, the silver, the road home across the heath, and they left the details for the following day. Levi paid for the last round of beer out of the coins in his pocket. Samuel finished his and stood up heavily and reached for his coat. Jones was the last to leave, and he lingered a moment at the door and looked back into the room, and the woman behind the barrel did not lift her head. Whether she guessed anything of what she had just heard, or whether she took it for the ordinary talk of ordinary drunks, is not written down anywhere, and I will not put a thought in her mouth she may never have had. Outside, the rain had eased a little, and the wind had shifted round to the north, and the road ran grey and empty in both directions. The three of them walked away together along the muddy verge, their boots printing deep in the wet, and then at a crossing of lanes they parted. Samuel went off toward Ash, where his wife lay in a cottage he had not been home to for 2 nights. Jones went the other way, back toward the farm and the loft above the cart shed. Levi Harwood stood a moment at the crossing after they had gone, and looked east along the road toward Frimley, and pulled his coat close about his throat, and set off in the direction of the lodging he kept, that autumn, with a woman near the London road. He had, we know from what came later, a good deal on his mind. What exact shape those thoughts took in the cold walk home under the ragged clouds is not for us to say. The record gives us the shape of the plan. It does not give us the shape of the mind that carried it. By Friday morning, the plan would have hardened. By Friday afternoon, a pistol would be borrowed. By Friday evening, the three of them would be walking east across the heath in the failing light, with a length of cord in one man's pocket and a short pistol in another's, toward a vicarage they had never seen, and a parson whose name most of them could not have said correctly on the first try. What waited for them at the end of that road was not the easy taking of a plated coffee pot and a set of monogrammed spoons. What waited for them was the small hours of a Friday morning, and a locked door, and an aging clergyman in a nightshirt on a landing, and the rest of their lives, however many hours of it remained, spent answering for what they had done there. A plan made in the rain. Let us come back to the road, then, where we left them. The three of them have parted at the crossing of the lanes, and the rain has moved on across the heath toward Bagshot, and the last hour of the Thursday night is running out. It is the Friday morning we want now, the 27th of September, in the year 1850, and the country west of Guildford is waking up wet. Levi Harwood woke first, or at least he woke earliest of the three. He kept, that autumn, a lodging in a cottage above the London road, in a room he took by the week from a woman whose husband was away at sea. The room was under the tiles at the back of the house, and it held a flock mattress on a wooden frame, a stool, a jug and basin on a plank, and a hook behind the door on which his coat and hat were hung together. The rain was still tapping on the roof above him when he opened his eyes. He lay a moment with his hands behind his head, watching the grey square of the window brighten by degrees, and listening to the woman moving about the kitchen underneath. We do not know what he was turning over in his mind in those first minutes of the morning. The record does not go into a labourer's head. It only tells us what he did, and it tells us that within half an hour of waking he was down the ladder stair and standing at the kitchen table in his shirt and eating a piece of bread with butter and drinking a mug of the woman's tea. He said little, by her later account, and she asked him nothing. She had learned, in the 4 or 5 weeks of his tenancy, that Levi Harwood was not a lodger who cared to be spoken to before he had eaten. She wiped her hands on her apron and went out through the back door to feed the fowls, and when she came in again, he was already gone. The road from the London highway to the beer shops of the Heath was a walk of about 2 miles, and the mud was ankle-deep in the ruts of the cart tracks. He kept to the verge. He met, on the way, a farm boy driving a cow to be milked, and a carrier's van with the tarpaulin lashed down over its load, and later, at the turning by the brickfields, an old man on a donkey. He passed each of them without a word. By 9 o'clock he was standing in the yard of a cottage set well back from the road, with the smoke of a kitchen fire coming out of the chimney, and a black and tan dog on a rope by the door. I want to be careful about the next part of the story, because the pistol matters, and how it came into their hands matters, and the trial reports do not entirely agree with one another on the point. The best account we have is that the pistol was borrowed that Friday morning from a labouring man on the edge of the parish, a man in his 50s who had kept it since his time in the militia 20 years before. It was a short, single-shot flintlock, of the pattern that a foot soldier would have carried at his belt in the last French wars, with a walnut stock rubbed dark by handling and a brass mount on the butt. The man who owned it did not carry it any more. It hung on a peg above the fireplace in his cottage, and it was loaded, as such pistols in country cottages very often were, against the possibility of a stranger at the back door. Levi asked for it, so the older man said afterward, on the pretext of a fox that had been at his lodging-keeper's hens. The story was not likely. Foxes were not usually taken with a horse pistol in the middle of a wet September, and the older man, in the honest hour of his examination before the magistrates, admitted that he had not much believed it at the time. He had lent it, all the same. The reasons for that lending are murky, and I do not want to invent a cleaner motive than the one the man himself gave. He said, plainly, that Levi Harwood was not a man he cared to refuse. He took the pistol from its peg, along with a horn of powder and 6 lead balls in a twist of paper, and he watched the younger man stow the whole of it inside his coat and walk out of the yard. By 11 o'clock, the pistol was in the loft above the cart shed at the farm near Ash, and James Jones was turning it over in his hands. He was, of the three of them, the one who had seen the inside of a barrack room. Whether he had ever fired a shot in earnest is not clear from anything the record puts down. He knew how to check the flint. He knew how to feel for the priming in the pan. He wiped the lock with a rag, set the pistol down on a board across 2 barrels, and looked at Levi. Come and stand with me for a moment in that loft, because it is a place that will not appear again in this story after tonight. It was reached by a ladder from the yard, through a hatch in the boards of the floor. The roof came low over the head, so that a tall man had to stoop unless he stood in the middle. There was a window at the gable end, unglazed, with a shutter of unpainted wood that could be dropped on a leather hinge. A heap of loose straw made the bed. A tin cup and a wooden bowl stood on the sill of the window, and a spare shirt hung on a nail. This was the whole of Jones's estate in the last week of September in the year 1850. What he owned in the world was in that loft. Samuel Harwood came up the ladder a little before noon. He had walked over from the cottage at Ash, where the record tells us his wife had been in bed with a low fever for 3 days, and where his 2 young children had been left in the care of a neighbour woman. Whether his wife knew where he was going that afternoon is a thing I cannot tell you. Nobody wrote it down. It is possible she did not ask. It is possible, and this is the more likely of the two, that she had learned across their marriage not to ask. She stayed in the cottage. Samuel came out into the wet, and climbed the ladder, and pulled himself up through the hatch, and stood a breath in the low room, looking from his cousin to Jones, and then to the pistol on the board. They spoke, then, of the vicarage. What they said in that loft has come down to us only in pieces, and the pieces do not all fit. From what Jones said afterward, from what a farm boy overheard through the boards, and from what Levi himself let slip in the days after the arrest, we can put together roughly this. They believed the house held plate to the value of 50 or 60 pounds, which was a very great sum indeed for men in their condition. They believed the parson to be an elderly gentleman, a widower, with no manservant sleeping in the house and no dog inside the doors. They were wrong on all 3 counts. The Reverend George Edward Hollist was 50 years old that autumn, which was not old for a country parson, and he had the strength of a man who had walked his parish on foot every day of his working life. He was not a widower. His wife Caroline slept beside him in the front bedchamber. There was a dog, in fact there were 2, both spaniels, and while they were not gun dogs bred to guard a house, they were not silent either. There was also a manservant. He slept above the coach house across the yard, and he was young, and he was strong, and he was, though the three men in the loft did not know it, a light sleeper. The plan, as they shaped it that afternoon over the pistol on the board, was of the simplest kind. They would come to the vicarage on foot, across the fields from the west, after the last light had gone. They would wait in the shrubbery until the house was dark. They would go in at the back, through the scullery door if it could be forced quietly, and through the pantry window if it could not. They would take the plate from the study drawer, and they would be out again and away across the heath before the household stirred. The pistol was for the manservant if he came down from the coach house. The length of cord that Jones drew out of his pocket and laid on the board beside the pistol was for anyone in the house who woke and had to be silenced. There was no plan for the parson himself. In their picture of the night, the parson was an old man asleep in a front bedchamber upstairs, and he did not come down. I want to stop for a breath here. I have taken you through a great many small facts in the last half hour, and I do not want you to lose the shape of the thing under the weight of them. What was made that afternoon in the loft above the cart shed at Ash was not a clever plan, and it was not a wicked plan. It was a poor plan. It rested on wrong information about the age of the man in the house, on wrong information about who else was in the house with him, and on the belief, which was almost pure hope, that three drunken labourers in wet coats could move through a strange dwelling in the dark without waking anyone in it. Everything that would go wrong that night went wrong along the fault lines of what they had assumed in the loft. I say this now, before we go any further, because when we come to the small hours of the Friday morning, and the shot on the landing, and the ruin of a household, it will be easy to make it sound like the working out of a cruel design. It was not. It was the working out of a bad guess made by tired men with drink still in them, and it was for that guess, more than for any settled cruelty of heart, that the parson would die, and that Levi Harwood and James Jones would go to the drop at Horsemonger Lane. By 3 o'clock, the plan was as fixed as it was going to get. Jones wrapped the pistol in a piece of oiled cloth and stowed it inside his coat against the small of his back. He kept the cord in his side pocket. Samuel took a short crowbar from a pile of tools in the corner of the loft, a thing of blackened iron perhaps 18 inches long that had been used for lifting flags out of a farmyard, and he pushed it up his sleeve and held the end of it against his palm inside his cuff. Levi carried nothing at all in his hands. He had, in his coat pocket, a stub of tallow candle and a tin box holding a scrap of tow and a flint and steel. If a candle was to be lit inside the vicarage that night, it would be lit from what he had in that pocket. Nothing else was carried between the three of them. No sack for the plate. No mask for the face. The record is very clear on that point. They took no mask and they took no sack. The court would make a good deal of it in due course on both sides. The prosecution would say it proved a cold professional intention. The defence would say the opposite, that men who intended a robbery in earnest would surely have taken the tools for one. The truth, as so often, was probably neither of those things. They were labouring men, and they trusted to what came to hand. The afternoon ran on. The rain slackened after 4, and thickened again after 5, and by 6:30 the light had gone out of the low sky, and the wind had turned north again, and the road across the heath was as empty as it had been the night before. Come with me now, out of the loft above the cart shed and down the ladder into the yard, because I do not want to leave you up in that room with the smell of oiled cloth and gunmetal and wet straw. Come out into the last of the day. The three of them stood in the yard a moment, pulling their coats close about them, and Samuel drank from a tin flask he had brought in his pocket, and passed it to Jones, and Jones passed it to Levi. What was in the flask was not water. The farm boy who saw them go out onto the road later told a magistrate that they were not staggering, but that they were not sober either, and that Jones was laughing at something under his breath as they went past the gate. Whether the laughter was at anything in particular, or whether it was the loose laughter of a nervous man, is not on any page I have seen. They took the lane east from the farm. The lane joined the road to Frimley within a mile, and the road to Frimley ran level across the heath for another 3 miles, before it dropped down into the hollow where the church tower stood among the yews. It was a road any of them could have walked in the dark from the memory of daylight, and they walked it now in the wet, 3 abreast where the ruts allowed and single file where they did not, and they said very little. Whatever needed to be said had been said already in the loft. The plan was in their pockets, in the shape of a pistol wrapped in cloth, and a length of cord, and a short crowbar, and a stub of candle in a tin box. Ahead of them, 4 miles off, the parson of Frimley was closing the shutter of his study window against the coming night, and calling the 2 spaniels to him from under the desk, and blowing out the candle on the writing table, and going up the stair to bed. The door gives way. I'll write chapter 5 now, holding the 2 voices and the fact thread from the earlier chapters. Come back with me to the vicarage then, while the 3 of them are still out on the road. We have an hour or so before they reach the gravel drive, and I want you to spend it inside the house, so that when the scullery door goes, you will know what room the sound is running through. The rain has thickened again, and the light has gone out of the sky above the yews, and the parson is closing up his study for the night. The Reverend George Edward Hollist was a man of steady habits. He had eaten his supper at 7. As he did every evening, the parish did not call him elsewhere, and he had sat afterward with Caroline in the parlour for the better part of an hour. What they spoke of on that Thursday evening at the end of September is not written down anywhere I have found. The parlour was on the ground floor at the front of the house, with 2 tall sash windows onto the drive, and a fire that had been lit against the wet more than the cold. Caroline sat in the chair nearest the hearth with her mending. The Reverend sat opposite her, with a periodical open on his knee. The 2 spaniels lay between them on the rug. We know from the household accounts that a tray was brought in a little after 8, with tea for Caroline and a pot of coffee for the Reverend, and that the tray was cleared again by past. We know the house prayers were read that evening in the dining room across the hall, as they were read every evening, with the servants standing and the master seated, and Caroline at his side. The prayer that closed the reading was the one for the household by night, out of the older book, the petition for defence against the perils and dangers of the night. It was said on the 26th of September in the year 1850, in a room with a candle on the sideboard and the rain moving against the window. It would be remembered, afterward, by everyone who had stood in that room to hear it. Let me name the household for you now, because I have been leaning on the word servants without being fair to them, and one of them is going to have a long night ahead. In the vicarage that autumn, there were, besides the Reverend and his wife, 4 persons who slept under the roof or in the buildings of the yard. The cook was a woman named Mary Turner, in her middle 40s, who had come to the household about 6 years before. The housemaid was a girl of 18 named Sarah, who had been in service there for something under a year, and whose surname the parish register spells 2 ways. There was a manservant whose name the trial reports render as Collie, a young man in his early 20s, strong-built, who slept above the coach house on the other side of the yard from the main house. And there was a nursewoman, an older widow of the village, who had come into the house that week to sit with a family member who was unwell, and who was to sleep on a cot in an upstairs room at the back. 5 souls, then, inside the house or attached to it. It is easier to hold the night in mind if you count them. By 9:30, the fire in the parlour had been raked down. Sarah moved through the ground floor with a candlestick, checking the bolts. She fastened the shutter of the parlour window on the drive side. She turned the key in the front door and drew the 2 heavy bolts, top and bottom. She went along the passage to the back of the house and did the same with the door into the yard. In the scullery, she pulled the bolt across the outer door and set the wooden bar in its iron cradle. In the kitchen, she banked the fire and set the guard in front of it. She did all of this, on that Thursday night, exactly as she had done it every night of her service in the house. Nothing in her memory of the round, given later to the magistrates, marks the evening out from any other. The house was closed up as it always was. I have to stop for a breath here and say a word about what closing up meant in a house of that sort in that year. The bolts on the outer doors were of iron, and they were heavy, and a man with the right tool could shift them from the outside if he was willing to make a noise. The scullery door in particular was the weakness of the house, and everyone in the trade of country burglary knew it. Scullery doors were built for the passage of buckets and coal scuttles, and the woman of the kitchen. They were not built to hold against a crowbar. This is not hindsight. It was true of every parsonage and every farmhouse across the county. The security of a country vicarage in 1850 rested less on the ironwork of its doors than on the general reluctance of the poor to lay hands on a clergyman. What kept a country parson safe in his bed was not his bolts. It was the idea of him. Once 3 men on a wet road had decided that the idea of him was no longer enough to keep them out. The bolts would only earn him a few minutes. Caroline went up the stair a little before 10. She undressed by the light of a single candle in the front bedchamber, folded her outer clothes over the back of the chair, and got into the bed on the side nearest the window. The reverend followed her a quarter of an hour later. He blew out his own candle on the writing desk in the study, spoke a word to the spaniels, and shut them into the study for the night. Both dogs would sleep there, on the rug beside the desk, as they had slept every night of their lives. This will matter presently. He climbed the stair heavily, in the way of a man of 50 at the end of a working day, and he came into the bedchamber and knelt for his private prayers by the side of the bed, as was his practice, and then he got in beside his wife and blew out the candle on the little table between them. By 10 o'clock, or a minute or two after, the front bedchamber of the vicarage was dark. "Come outside with me now, because we are going to lose the house for a while, and I want you to see it from the outside, as the 3 men will see it when they come up out of the fields." The rain is running off the tiles of the porch, and the drip is falling into the gravel below. There is no light in any window at the front of the house. There is no light in the servants' quarters at the back either, because the cook and the housemaid have both gone up their stair by 10:30 and have blown out their candles. The nursewoman in the room at the back is asleep in her cot, with the small lamp on the washstand turned down to a bead. The manservant, Collie, is asleep above the coach house on the far side of the yard, with the yard door bolted between his room and the main house. The rooks in the yews are silent. The 2 spaniels in the study are curled nose to tail on the rug. The clock in the hall is ticking through the last hour before midnight, and no one in the house knows that anything is coming. The 3 men had crossed the last field a little after midnight. They came up out of the hollow where the stream runs, along the line of the hedge, and they climbed the low wall into the shrubbery on the west side of the drive. Levi was in front. Samuel came next, with the short crowbar still up his sleeve. Jones came last, with the pistol wrapped in oiled cloth against the small of his back and the length of cord in his side pocket. They stood together in the wet under the laurels, and they did not speak. They were not, in that first quarter of an hour, doing anything that a poacher or a courting boy might not have been doing. They were only 3 shapes in a shrubbery on a rainy night, waiting for a house to settle. They waited a long time. The trial evidence, gathered from what Jones said afterward and from what Levi let fall in his own examination, puts the wait at close on an hour and a half. The clock in the hall struck 1, and they were still there. The rain came and went in the shrubbery above them. A fox crossed the drive at the far end and did not see them. One of the 2 spaniels in the study lifted its head at the sound of the fox and dropped it again. Nothing else moved. By 1:30 they were stiff with the cold and wet through to the shirt, and Samuel, who was the least patient of the 3 of them, whispered that they should go in now or go home. Levi did not answer him at once. He stood a moment more under the drip of the laurel leaves, watching the black shape of the house against the lesser black of the sky, and then he pushed himself off the trunk of the tree he had been leaning against and stepped out onto the gravel of the drive. They came round the back of the house by the path that ran along the west side, past the shuttered window of the parlour and past the closed shutter of the study beyond it. The gravel was loud under their boots, and they moved onto the grass of the border to muffle themselves, and they came round the corner into the yard by the coach house. The yard door was bolted, as we know. They did not try it. They went along under the shadow of the wall, keeping close to the brick, and they came to the scullery door at the far end of the back passage, and there they stopped. I want to slow down here, because what happens in the next few minutes is the crossing of a line. Everything that has happened in this story until this moment has been talk. Talk in a beer shop, talk in a loft, talk in the wet on a road. A man can turn back from talk. Once a crowbar goes into the frame of a door, and the iron of a lock begins to bend, a different sort of night has begun, and the men doing it know it as well as the man asleep upstairs will shortly know it. Samuel drew the short crowbar out of his sleeve. Jones held the end of the oiled cloth clear of the pistol at his back and stood watch, with his face turned to the corner of the yard and his ear cocked toward the coach-house. Levi took the crowbar from Samuel and set the flat of it into the crack between the door and the jamb, an inch above the lock. He worked it in with the heel of his hand, feeling for the bite of the iron against the wood. The record, when it came to be given by the joiner who examined the door the next day, said that the tool had been set with more skill than one might have expected. That may be a comment on Levi. It may equally be a comment on how bad the joiner thought most country burglars were. Either way, the bar found its purchase, and Levi leaned his weight on the outer end, and the frame of the door began to complain. It is worth stopping to picture what that complaint sounded like from the inside. In the scullery, on the other side of the door, there was no one to hear it. The scullery was empty, and the cook's room was at the far end of the passage above it, and Sarah's room was above that again, and both women were asleep. The nurse-woman was at the other end of the house entirely. The two spaniels in the study heard the first creak of the wood and lifted their heads together, ears up, and one of them made a sound in its throat that was not quite a growl, and then they both were still, listening. Above them, in the front bedchamber, Caroline turned in her sleep and did not wake. The reverend did not stir at all. The second push, harder than the first, cracked the wood. The third splintered a length of the frame away from the jamb, and the bolt inside gave with a small, dull sound, and the door swung a hand's breadth inward on its hinges. Levi drew the crowbar out. Samuel took it back from him and slid it up his sleeve again. Jones came round from his post at the corner of the yard, and the three of them stood a breath at the threshold of the Vicarage of Frimley, and looked into the black square of the scullery, and listened. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. The clock in the hall of the house, a dozen yards ahead of them through the passage, ticked evenly through the silence. Levi took the tin box out of his coat pocket and struck the flint against the steel, and the scrap of tow caught, and he lit the stub of tallow candle from the tow, and he held the candle up in his left hand. The light of it fell yellow across the flags of the scullery floor, across the copper set into the wall by the fire, across the wooden bar of the door lying on the stones where it had fallen from its cradle. He stepped over the bar. Samuel came after him. Jones came last, and pulled the broken door as close to shut behind him as its splintered frame allowed, and turned into the passage after the candle, and the three of them together, in a line, began to move toward the front of the sleeping house. Above them, on the boards of the study floor, the two spaniels rose at last together, and one of them barked once and stopped, and the other went to the door of the study and stood at it, with its nose against the crack, and the sound in its throat this time was low and long and unmistakable. Upstairs, in the front bedchamber, the Reverend George Edward Hollist opened his eyes in the dark. Chapter 5 written, Team 500 words, in continuous prose, with the companion voice touching down 4 times, opening, closing up aside, going outside, the crossing the line pause. Each of the 3 record gaps admitted, Sarah's surname, what the couple spoke of, the joiner's ambiguous comment, and ending on the Reverend waking so it flows straight into Chapter 6's shot on the landing. The shot on the landing. The Reverend did not sit up at once. He lay a moment on his back in the dark, listening, in the way a man listens for the sound that has already woken him and has not repeated itself. The rain was still moving on the roof above the front bedchamber. The clock in the hall below struck the 2:30. Then it came again, from the study directly beneath him, the low sound in the throat of a spaniel who has heard something he does not know. Come and lie in that bed with him for a breath, if you can bear it, because the next few minutes of his life are the ones we have to walk him through, and I would like you to be near him for them. He is 50 years old. He has slept in this room, in this bed, on this side of it nearest the door, for close on 2 decades. He knows the sounds of his own house better than he knows the sounds of his own body. What he is hearing now, in the dark of a wet Friday morning, is a sound that does not belong to the house at all. Caroline stirred beside him. She said his name, once, in the tone of a woman half in a dream, and he laid a hand on her arm to still her. He did not speak. He listened. From the study below there came now the second sound, plainer than the first, the muted scrape of a boot on the flagged passage outside the study door. The dog beneath the desk barked, sharp and single, and was answered by the other, and then both fell silent together, the way trained animals do when they have decided that the intruder is a man and not a fox. He got out of the bed. He did it without haste and without fumbling, because a man who has risen from this bed 1,000 times can rise from it in the dark without stumbling into the washstand. He drew on the pair of loose trousers that were folded across the back of the chair and pulled the nightshirt down over them. He did not stop to find the boots. He crossed the boards of the bedchamber in his stockinged feet, and he opened the top drawer of the tall press that stood against the wall between the 2 windows, and he took out the pistol. We should stop for the pistol, because there is more than one in this story now, and the 2 will meet each other in about 3 minutes' time on the landing outside this door. The Reverend's pistol was a percussion cap of the ordinary domestic pattern, a short-barrelled thing kept, like the one in the older labourer's cottage on the far side of the parish, against the possibility of a stranger at the door. It had been in the drawer since he had brought it into the house on his marriage to Caroline 19 years before. It was loaded. It had been loaded, so far as anyone in the household could tell, for the whole of that time. Whether the powder in it that night was of any use after 19 wet Surrey winters is a thing no one has ever been able to answer. Caroline sat up in the bed. She said his name a second time, wider awake now, and this time he did answer her, and what he said to her the record does not preserve. 2 accounts were given afterwards, one by Caroline herself in the days when her husband still lived, and one by the nursewoman in the back room, who woke a minute later and heard voices in the front bedchamber through the wall. The 2 accounts do not agree on the words, and I will not invent a version that fits between them. What we can say, and what both women agreed upon, is that he spoke to her calmly, and that he told her to stay where she was, and that he was already at the door of the bedchamber before she could get out of the bed to follow him. He opened the door. The passage outside the front bedchamber ran the width of the house, from the head of the main stair on the right to the door of the back bedchamber on the left, and it was lit, on that Friday morning at 2:30, by nothing at all. He stood a breath on the threshold with the pistol in his right hand and his left hand still on the door frame. From the stair below him there came now the small yellow bloom of a candle, moving. He could see, from where he stood, the top of the newel post, and above it the drift of the light on the panelling of the stairwell, and he could hear the tread of boots coming up the treads 2 by 2, in the walking rhythm of men who were still trying to be quiet and who had almost given up on it. Let me lower my voice again for a moment, because this next passage matters, and I do not want the shape of it to be lost under the pace of the telling. There is a version of this story, and it was told in the newspapers of the day, in which the Reverend of Frimley met the men on the landing with a great cry of defiance, and stood upon his rights as a Christian gentleman, and challenged them in the name of God. That version is a comforting one. It is also, so far as anything in the trial evidence supports it, not true. What the record puts down, gathered from Caroline in the bedchamber behind him, and from the men on the stair in front of him, is only this. He stepped out into the passage in his nightshirt and his loose trousers, with the pistol held down at his side, and he said, in an ordinary tone, the 2 words, "Who's there?" The candle stopped moving on the stair. There was a breath in which nothing happened. Levi Harwood, in the front of the line, held the stub of tallow up above his head with his left hand, and put his right hand on the newel post, and looked up along the line of light at the shape of the parson at the head of the stair. Samuel was on the tread below him. Jones was 2 treads below Samuel, with the oiled cloth already off the pistol and the pistol in his right hand, cocked at his hip. "Come away for one breath, because I want to give you something to hold when the shot comes." The passage on which the reverend was standing was about 4 feet wide between the wall and the banister. The stair came up to it on the right. The door of the front bedchamber, out of which he had just stepped, was set into the wall 2 paces to his left, and it was standing open behind him. Caroline was inside the bedchamber, out of the bed by now, in her nightgown, her hand on the post of the bed. The nursewoman at the back of the house had heard the voices and had lit her lamp, and was fastening her wrapper about her, and was coming to the door of her own room. The cook and the housemaid, in their rooms above the kitchen at the far end of the house, had not yet woken. The manservant Collie, across the yard above the coach-house, had not yet woken. The 2 spaniels in the study, on the ground floor below, were standing together at the door of the study, with their noses at the crack, and the older one was growling now in a way that would not stop. What was said on the stair in the 10 seconds that followed the reverend's question is not entirely clear. Levi Harwood, in his own examination before the magistrates a week later, said that he had told the parson to go back into his room and to keep still, and that no harm would come to him or to his wife if he did so. Jones, examined separately, said that Levi had said nothing at all, and that it was Samuel who had spoken, and that Samuel had told the parson to stand aside and let them by. Both men, in the way of men in their position, were giving the account that placed themselves furthest from the shot. The truth is probably that someone on the stair spoke, and that the reverend did not step back into the bedchamber, and did not stand aside, and did not lay the pistol down. He raised it. I do not want you to picture this the way a stage would picture it, because a stage would give you a slow lift of the arm, and a long look between the 2 men over the barrel, and a moment for a decision to be made in the eye of the parson before the trigger was pulled. It was not like that. The candle in Levi's hand was jumping. The pistol in the reverend's hand came up in one movement, and it did not come up steady, because it is a heavy thing to lift in the dark at 2:30 in the morning, after 19 years in a drawer. It came up to the level of Levi's shoulder, or perhaps a little short of it, and it stayed there half a breath, and it did not fire. Whether he tried to fire, and the powder failed him, or whether he lifted the pistol only to threaten, and did not intend to fire at all, no one in this world will ever know for certain. Caroline, in the room behind him, could not see what his hand was doing. The men on the stair, in the poor light of a jumping candle, could see only that a pistol had been raised at them. Jones, 2 treads below Samuel, brought his own pistol up from his hip in the same instant, and, without stepping past his cousin, and without a word, he fired. The shot was not loud in the way you might imagine. Old houses, with their thick plastered walls and their heavy hangings, swallow the sound of a small pistol at close range in a way that surprises people. Caroline, in the bedchamber, heard it as a flat clap, not much greater than the closing of a heavy book. The cook, in her room at the far end of the house, heard it in her sleep and did not wake at once. The manservant, above the coach-house across the yard, did not hear it at all. What people heard, in that house, in that instant, was less the shot than the sound the reverend made when the ball took him. It was, by every account that touched on it afterwards, a small sound, an intake of breath rather than a cry, the noise of a man who has been struck hard and has not yet understood what has struck him. He did not fall at once. He stepped back half a pace, so that his shoulder came against the frame of the bedchamber door, and he stayed there a moment, upright, with the pistol still in his hand, and the muzzle now pointed at the boards of the passage floor. The ball had entered him low in the belly, on the left side, below the ribs. It had not passed through. It was still inside him, and it would still be inside him a week later, when the surgeons who came out from Guildford would fail, in the poor light of that same bedchamber, to find it. He did not know any of that yet. He knew only that he had been hit, and that his hand had gone slack on the pistol, and that Caroline behind him was calling his name in a tone that had risen out of sleep and out of fear into something he had never heard from her in the whole of their marriage. On the stair, no one moved for a breath. Jones stood with the pistol still level, the smoke of the shot drifting up in the light of Levi's candle. Levi's mouth was open. Samuel, on the tread between them, had turned his head half round toward his cousin, as if he did not quite believe the sound he had just heard behind his own ear. It was Levi who moved first. He came up the last 3 treads at a run, past the reverend leaning on the bedchamber doorframe, and he went straight down the passage to the head of the back stair, and he was down it and gone into the passage below before the smoke on the landing had begun to thin. Samuel followed him. Jones came last, and as he came up onto the landing he did the thing that will make it hardest for him afterwards. He did not run past the reverend. He stopped at his shoulder. He looked at him a breath, at close range, with the spent pistol still in his hand. And then he stepped past him, into the doorway of the front bedchamber, and he saw Caroline standing at the post of the bed, and he raised the pistol at her, though the pistol was empty and he knew it was empty, and he said to her, low, that she should not scream and should not follow, and that they were going. And then he was gone after the other 2, down the back stair, out through the passage, out through the broken scullery door into the yard, and away over the wall into the wet fields, and there was no one on the landing any more but the parson, sagging now against the door-frame, and his wife, coming out of the bedchamber to catch him under the arms before he went down. The clock in the hall struck the 3rd quarter after 2. The 2 spaniels, released at last by the flight of the men, came up the stair together in a scramble of paws and pressed themselves against the reverend's stockinged feet, and stayed there. The candle that Levi had dropped as he ran was guttering on its side, on the 3rd tread from the top, and Caroline reached across to it, without letting go of her husband, and she pinched the wick between her fingers to save the house from a fire, and she called down the passage for the nursewoman by name, and the long vigil in that house had begun. The long vigil. The house did not fall quiet when the men were gone. It could not. There was a wounded man on the landing, and a woman holding him under the arms, and a nursewoman coming out of the back room with a lamp in her hand, and behind them, through the open door of the front bedchamber, the linen of the bed still turned back where 2 people had lain in it not 5 minutes before. Come with me into that passage now. I do not want you to look at his face. I only want you to stand near enough to feel how much he weighs against his wife's shoulder, because that is the weight she is going to carry through the next 6 days of her life. Caroline was a woman of 47 that autumn. She was not large. The reverend was a man of about her own height, but heavier through the shoulders, and half a stone at least the wrong side of easy carrying. She did not try to move him back into the bed at once. She braced him instead against the door-frame, and she called for the nursewoman to bring the lamp closer, and the 2 of them together got a hand under each of his arms, and they walked him the 3 paces from the landing to the edge of the bed, and they sat him on it. He was still holding the pistol. He did not seem to know that he was holding it. Caroline took it from his hand and set it on the washstand, and the nursewoman drew back the covers, and between them they got him lying flat. I want to admit something here, because it has been on my mind through the whole of this hour. The account of what happened in that bedchamber over the next few days comes to us in 2 forms. There are the notes the doctor kept, which are careful in the way a country surgeon's notes are careful, and there are the words Caroline herself spoke, later, to the magistrate, and later still to the coroner. Between the 2 of them the medical shape of the week is fairly clear. What is not clear, and never will be, is what the 2 of them said to each other in the long hours when the doctor was not in the room. They had been married 19 years. She sat with him a great deal of that week. The record does not preserve those conversations, and I am not going to invent them. The nursewoman, whose name was Anne Fisher, was the first to look at the wound. She had been in the house 4 days by then, sitting with a younger member of the household who had been unwell, and she had done such work before. She washed her hands in the basin on the washstand, and she asked Caroline to hold the lamp, and she opened the front of the nightshirt where it had begun to darken. The ball had gone in an inch or so below the ribs on the left side. There was a small round mark, no larger than the head of a walking stick, and around it the skin had begun to bruise. The bleeding was not heavy on the outside. That was the trouble. The bleeding was heavy on the inside, where no one in that room could see it or reach it, and Anne Fisher, who had washed farm labourers hurt by carts and pitchforks in her time, knew that the smallness of the outer wound was the worst sign it could have given her. "Come outside the bedchamber with me for a moment, because the house is beginning to move now, and I would like you to see it moving." The cook and the housemaid were on the stair by this time in their wrappers, holding a candle between them, and Sarah the housemaid was crying without making a sound. The manservant Collie had been fetched from above the coach house by a hand on his shoulder, and he was already pulling his boots on in the yard. Caroline came out onto the landing to speak to him. What she said to him was preserved by Collie himself in his examination the following week, and it is one of the few sentences from that morning we do have. She said, "Ride for Dr. Cole, and do not stop for anyone." Collie was a young man, 22 years old, strong-built, as I told you, and he was in the saddle of the Vicarage cob within 7 or 8 minutes of being woken, and he was out of the yard by 3 in the morning, with the rain in his face, and the road ahead of him, running 6 miles east to Bagshot, where Dr. Cole kept his house. I will let him ride, because there is nothing to say about a man on a road in the dark, except that he is on it, and I want to come back to the bedchamber, where the parson is beginning to speak. He had been silent, or nearly silent, from the shot until they had him lying flat. It is a common thing with a bad wound. The body does not want to spend breath on words while it is trying to understand what has been done to it. Now, with his wife holding his hand on the near side and the nursewoman folding a bandage against the wound, he opened his eyes properly for the first time since he had risen from the bed, and he asked her, in an ordinary tone, whether she had been hurt. Caroline told him she had not. He asked her about the servants. She told him they were unhurt as well. He shut his eyes then, and he lay a long moment breathing, and when he opened them again he said, more slowly, that he thought there had been 3 of them. That was the first line of his testimony. 3 of them. His wife wrote it down later in a book she kept, and she gave the book to the magistrate the following week, and that book was read aloud in the courtroom at Kingston on the Assize day. Dr. Cole came into the yard a little before 5. He had ridden the 6 miles from Bagshot without stopping, and the horse was blown, and he came up the stair still in his outer coat with the rain running off it onto the boards. He was a man of about the reverend's own age, and the 2 of them had known each other for close on 20 years. He asked Caroline to leave the room for the length of the examination. She would not. He asked a second time. She still would not, and he did not ask again. He set his case down on the washstand, and he opened it, and he lit a second lamp from the first, and he began, in the poor light of a wet October dawn coming grey through the sash windows, to look for the ball. He did not find it. I want to be honest about what a search of that kind meant, in a country bedchamber in 1850, without any of the tools a surgeon would want to have for it. He had a probe, a thin instrument of silver, and he had his own 2 hands, and he had the light of 2 oil lamps, and whatever grey glow the window would give him. He worked at the wound for the better part of an hour. He asked the reverend to tell him if the probe touched the ball. The reverend did not speak of the pain, and I think it is fair to say that he did not, because he had decided that he would not. But he told the doctor, twice, that he could feel nothing beyond the probe. At the end of the hour, Dr. Cole set the probe aside, and he washed his hands in the basin, and he stepped away from the bed, and he said to Caroline, quietly, in the corner by the door, that the ball had gone deep, and that he could not reach it without doing more harm than the ball itself. He dressed the wound instead. He gave the reverend a small measure of laudanum. He sat down in the chair by the bed, and he stayed there through the whole of Friday. Let the day open around them for a moment. It is the morning of the 27th of September, and the parish is beginning to wake to what has happened, because word has run out of the vicarage with the return of the cob from Bagshot, and it has passed to the sexton, and from the sexton to the churchwardens, and by breakfast time on that Friday there is not a house within the sound of the bell that does not know that the parson has been shot in his own bed. The rooks were loud in the Yews. Farm hands stopped in the lane and took their caps off. The younger of the two curates, from the next parish over, rode in through the vicarage gate a little after 9, and Caroline came down to him at the front door and told him, in the calm tone that she was to keep for the whole of the 6 days, that her husband was still living, and that he was speaking, and that he had asked for the parish to be prayed for at morning service in the ordinary way. The magistrate, whose name was Sir Edward Coleridge, arrived from Guildford at midday. He had been sent for as soon as the news reached the town. He came in a dark coat with a clerk beside him, and he sat by the bed for 2 hours that afternoon, and he took down the reverend's testimony in his own hand. This was not the leisurely sort of statement a magistrate might take in an ordinary case. It was what the law of that century called a dying deposition. A dying deposition, in a court of the reign of Queen Victoria, could be read aloud at the trial as if the man who had spoken it were still living, provided that at the moment of speaking he had believed himself to be about to die. Sir Edward asked the reverend, before he wrote anything, whether he believed he would recover. The reverend said that he did not. That single answer, given in an even tone from the bed, opened the door for everything else he said that afternoon to be used, later, at Kingston, in the trial of Levi Harwood and James Jones. He gave the men as he had seen them on the stair. He said there had been 3, and he described them as best he could in the poor light of a stub of candle. He said one of them had been carrying the candle, and that this one had had the pistol at his belt. He was wrong on that point, as it turned out. He had confused which man had held the candle and which had held the pistol. It is easy to blame him, at this distance, for a mistake in the dark by a wounded man of 50 who had held his own pistol for the first time in 19 years. Sir Edward did not blame him. He wrote it down as it was given, and he read it back, and the reverend nodded at the parts of it he could confirm, and he lay silent at the parts of it he could not. When it was finished, the reverend signed his name to it with the pen Sir Edward put into his hand. His signature is on file in Surrey to this day. It is not a steady signature. The days that followed ran together in the way days do in a sick room. Dr. Cole rode back and forth between Bagshot and Frimley twice a day. A second surgeon came in from Guildford on the Saturday and looked at the wound and shook his head and agreed with Dr. Cole that the ball could not be reached. Fever came on that same afternoon, as everyone in the house had feared it would. Anne Fisher took the day watch. Caroline took the night. The nursewoman told the doctor, on the Sunday morning, that the mistress had not lain down at all since the Friday, and that she would not be persuaded to. Dr. Cole tried to persuade her himself. She thanked him and remained where she was, in the chair by the bed, with her hand on the reverend's hand, hour after hour of the wet October night. He was lucid for most of that week. That is the part of it that has always stayed with me. The laudanum kept the worst of the pain from him, but it did not take his mind. He spoke, at intervals, when the fever gave him room. He asked about the parish. He asked about the harvest. He asked whether the churchwardens had been to the door. He asked, once, whether the men had been caught, and Caroline told him what news had come in from Guildford, that there were rumours in the taprooms, and that a labourer answering to the name Harwood had been seen with a coat that did not fit him, and he nodded, and shut his eyes, and did not ask again. The last full conversation he had with anyone was on the morning of Wednesday, the 2nd of October. He spoke to Caroline for perhaps half an hour. What passed between them then is not written down, and I am not going to guess at it. Dr. Cole was in the house that morning as well, and Sir Edward Coleridge came out again from Guildford in the afternoon, and the Reverend put his hand on the deposition when it was read back to him a final time, and he confirmed it as true. He died a little before 8 that evening, without a great struggle, with his wife in the chair beside him, and the 2 spaniels lying across the foot of the bed, where they had lain all week. Come outside the house with me. The night of the 2nd of October was clear, and there was a moon over the Yews, and the bell was ringing already for the passing of the parson before the surgeon had finished writing the certificate. It rang out across the fields and along the lanes and into the taprooms on the edge of the Heath, where a certain kind of man was drinking too fast and looking too often at the door. And in Guildford, in a small back room over a public house, a constable was writing down the name he had been given that morning by a woman who had been paid too little to keep it, and he was folding the paper into his coat, and he was going to fetch his hat. The hunt across the Heath. The bell that rang for the parson on the evening of the 2nd of October was heard, as I told you, in the taprooms on the edge of the Heath. It was heard in Frimley itself, where the parishioners came out into the lane and stood with their heads uncovered until it stopped. Carters on the turnpike between Bagshot and Guildford heard it too, though they did not yet know whose bell it was. But the taprooms are where we have to go, because that is where the case broke, and it broke faster than anyone in the vicarage had dared to hope it might. Come with me into one of them, if you can bear the smell of it, because a public house on the edge of the Heath in the autumn of 1850 was not the sort of room you would have chosen to sit in for pleasure. Whitewashed once, brown now with the smoke of 100 pipes, it had sawdust on the flagstones and a bench along the wall for the labourers who worked on the roads. A table by the fire held the men who owned a cottage of their own, and a narrow counter at the back carried a shelf of pewter and a barrel on trestles. The landlord kept a lamp on the counter, and the lamp threw a yellow half-circle onto the ceiling, and everything beyond the half-circle was dark. Men who did not want their faces seen sat in the dark. Men who did not care sat by the fire. Levi Harwood, on the Saturday evening after the shooting, had not yet begun to be careful. That was the first thing the constables would come to understand about him. He was a labourer from the parish of Send, 32 years old, and he had spent most of the daylight hours of the Friday sleeping off the wet of the night before in a barn owned by a farmer who did not know he was there. By the evening he was on the road again, and by the evening after that he was in the taproom of the Wheatsheaf, 3 miles the Guildford side of Frimley, with a coat on his back that fitted him at the shoulders and hung loose at the wrists. It was not his coat. It had come out of the reverend's press. I want to admit here, before we go any further, that the exact route of the coat from the vicarage to the taproom is one of the things the record does not quite fix. It appears in the deposition of the landlord's wife as being on Levi's back at the Wheatsheaf on the Saturday evening. It appears in the inventory the housemaid made under Caroline's direction on the Monday morning as being one of 2 absent from the press in the front bedchamber. Between those 2 entries, the coat travelled some miles of the parish in the arms of 3 tired men, and no one wrote down which of them had lifted it out of the press in the dark. What can be said, and what will bear the weight of the case afterwards, is that Levi wore it into the Wheatsheaf, and that the landlord's wife looked at it twice, and that she remembered it. She was a woman of about 35, and she had grown up in service in a rectory over near Ash, and she knew a clergyman's coat when she saw one on a labourer's back. She did not speak to him. She served him his beer, went into the back kitchen, and told her husband, in an undertone, that the man on the bench by the door was wearing a coat that had never been made for him. Her husband put his head round the taproom door and looked, and he said nothing either. But he watched Levi for the rest of that hour, and he noticed the coat again when Levi went out, and he noticed one thing more. Levi paid for his beer, and for the pie he took away with him wrapped in a cloth, out of a purse of good calfskin with a silver clasp. The clasp had been engraved with a set of initials. He could not read them from across the taproom, but he could tell they were not the letter L. Let me leave the Wheatsheaf for a moment, because the coat is going to do its work now without help from us. Come outside with me, into the lane, where the evening is closing over the heath and the rooks are going up out of the plantation for the last time before they settle. The wind is off the north, and it is beginning to bite in the way an English autumn bites at the seam of September and October. Not sharp, not yet, but steady, so that a man in a borrowed coat that fits him at the shoulder and hangs loose at the wrist will draw it tight across his chest and be glad of it. That coat has 3 days left on his back before it walks him to the county gaol. Word from the vicarage had reached the Guildford constables by the middle of Friday morning. The superintendent of the borough force, whose name was Biddlecombe, had ridden out himself to Frimley on the afternoon of the shooting, and he had spent an hour with Caroline and Dr. Cole at the front door, and he had gone up into the front bedchamber and looked once at the reverend, and he had come down again with a face nobody in the house had ever seen him wear before. He was a man of the county, and he had known the parson by sight for 20 years. He rode back to Guildford that evening with a list in his pocket of every item Caroline could remember missing from the press and the plate cupboard, and he called 4 of his constables into the yard behind the station and gave them the list, and he told them to go out into every public house within 8 miles of Frimley and to listen, and to say nothing, and to come back to him at the end of the following day. They came back with the coat. They came back with the calfskin purse. They came back, most of all, with the name Harwood, because a labourer of that name had been seen in 3 separate houses on the Saturday and had been buying too freely for a man who worked on the roads and had been talking, in the way tired and frightened men talk when they have had a few glasses, of a parson at Frimley who had not put up much of a fight. He did not use those words in any of the houses. What he said, so far as the constables could piece it together later from 4 different taproom overhearings, was that a certain gentleman in a Surrey parish had thought better of standing in his own doorway once a pistol had been put to him, and that the gentleman was in no condition to give evidence about it now. That was on the Saturday evening, 3 days before the reverend actually died. Levi did not yet know that the reverend was going to die. He was, on the strength of the shooting alone, already a hanged man in every taproom that would repeat his talk to a constable, and he did not know it. Here is a thing about the taprooms of the country in that year that I would like you to hold, because it explains a great deal of the speed of what happened next. The public houses on the Heath were not private places. The landlord of the Wheatsheaf, and the landlord of the Jolly Farmer at Pierbright, and the landlord of the Fox at Bisley, all knew the superintendent at Guildford by his given name. Every one of them stood to lose his licence at the next quarter sessions if he did not answer plainly when a constable came in and asked plainly. It took Biddlecombe less than 72 hours from the shooting to have 4 separate landlords put their signatures to statements that placed Levi Harwood on the Saturday evening with clothing and money he had no business with, and Levi Harwood on the Sunday morning walking east along the Guildford road with 2 other men who answered in build and in voice to the descriptions the reverend had given from his bed on the Friday afternoon. The other 2 were harder to name. The second of them, Samuel Harwood, was Levi's cousin, and he was known in the parish of Send as a man who kept close to his cousin, and it did not take long, once Levi had a name against him, for Samuel to have one too. The third was a stranger to the Heath. He had come out from London for the job, and he went back to London on the Sunday, and by the time the Guildford constables were writing their reports on the Monday morning, James Jones was 60 miles east of them and drinking in a court off the Ratcliffe Highway, with a piece of the reverend's plate wrapped in a rag inside his coat. I want to stop for the plate, because the plate is what will hang 2 of them. Caroline had given Biddlecombe, on the Friday afternoon, an inventory that ran to 11 items. A coffee pot of plated ware, engraved on the underside, with the reverend's initials, in a script that a jeweller's apprentice could read across a shop. 6 spoons of the same silver, and of the same engraving. A caster for the sugar. A snuff-box of tortoiseshell mounted in silver, which had been a gift to the reverend from his father on his ordination. A pair of candlesticks. And the coat. The candlesticks and one of the spoons went out of the Wheatsheaf in Levi's pockets and were pledged, on the Sunday morning, at a receiver's in Guildford, whose door the constables had watched since before dawn. That receiver was arrested at 8 o'clock in the morning, with the 2 candlesticks under his counter and the spoon in a drawer. He gave up Levi Harwood before his own dinner. They took Levi at the Wheatsheaf on the Monday evening. He was on the same bench he had sat on the Saturday, and he was wearing the same coat, and he was carrying, in the pocket of it, 3 of the reverend's spoons. He put up no fight of any kind. When the constable laid a hand on his shoulder, he said only that he had wondered how long it would be. That was another sentence the constables wrote down, and another sentence that was read at the Assize. Samuel came in on the Tuesday. He was found in a barn near Chobham, asleep on a heap of sacking, with the reverend's snuff-box in his coat, and a bruise on his face he could not account for. He did fight, or he began to, and one of the constables laid him out with the butt of a truncheon, and he came round in the cart on the way to Guildford, and he spent the rest of the ride in a silence that lasted, so far as anyone in the borough station could tell, until well past his second night in the cells. Jones was harder. "Come with me now to London, because we have to follow a strand of this case out of the county and into the city if we are to see it whole." The Guildford force did not have men to spare for a search of the Ratcliffe highway, but they had, in Biddlecombe himself, a superintendent who knew what to do about that. He sent, on the Monday afternoon, a written request up to the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, and by the Wednesday there were 2 detective officers walking the courts off the highway with a description of Jones and of the plate. It was a spoon that did it. A pawnbroker in Cable Street had taken in a spoon on the Tuesday morning that carried initials he could not match to the man who had brought it, and he had held it back rather than showing it in the window because a pawnbroker in that stretch of the city in 1850 had reasons of his own to keep his head. When the detectives came in on the Wednesday with the description, he brought the spoon out from a locked drawer under the counter, and he pointed the way to a room over a chandler's shop 3 streets off, and Jones was taken there before nightfall. He had the tortoise-shell snuff-box on him, and he had, still, the pistol. "The pistol is the last thread I want to give you before I let this hour go." It was not Jones's own. He had borrowed it, on the Wednesday before the shooting, from a man in Bermondsey, who owed him a modest sum, and he had promised to return it inside the week. The man in Bermondsey had told him, when he handed it over, that it was a good piece, and that the charge in it had been fresh drawn on the Monday. That man was found by the Metropolitan officers on the Thursday morning, and he made a statement that same day, and he was taken to Kingston as a witness. He did not lose his liberty over it, because a man who lends a pistol is not, in the law of that year, guilty of the use to which it is put. But he spent one grey morning in a witness box, and he said, in front of the jury, that the pistol on the table before him was the pistol he had put into the hand of James Jones on the Wednesday before Michaelmas. By the middle of the second week of October, then, Superintendent Biddlecombe had, in the county gaol at Kingston, 3 men, all charged with the wilful murder of the Reverend George Edward Hollist, clerk. He had a coat, 3 spoons, a coffee pot, a caster, 2 candlesticks, a tortoise-shell snuff-box, and a pistol. He had statements from 4 landlords, a receiver, a pawnbroker, and a man in Bermondsey. He had the deposition the Reverend had signed with the pen Sir Edward Coleridge had put into his hand. He had Caroline's inventory in her own hand. And he had, waiting for him in the spring, a courtroom that would be, when its doors opened, one of the fullest that county town had ever seen. The Assize at Kingston. Come with me now to Kingston upon Thames, on a morning in the middle of March in the year 1851. The winter has broken, though not warmly, and the wind coming off the river is still cold enough to raise colour in the faces of the men standing on the pavement outside the Assize Court. It is Wednesday, the 26th of March. It is not yet 9 o'clock, and the queue for the public gallery already runs the length of the marketplace and turns the corner at the mouth of Church Street. I want you to understand what an Assize Court was in the county of Surrey in that year, before we go inside. It was not a place where the ordinary business of a market town was heard. It was a place that opened twice a year, in the Lent term and in the summer, for the trial of the crimes the county magistrates could not sentence themselves. Highway robbery came here. Rape came here. Forgery in a large way came here. And murder came here without exception, because a hanging was a thing only a judge of the superior courts, riding down from Westminster with a commission in his baggage, was permitted to order. When the Assize came to Kingston then, the town knew about it. Lodgings filled. The Sun Inn on the marketplace gave up its best 2 rooms to the judge and his marshal. Bar boys were sent out from the tap rooms with jugs of hot ale for the constables watching the doors. Wives who did not care for the courts kept their children in from the street. The court itself stood on the corner of the marketplace, a plain brick building of 2 stories, with a pair of iron lamps over the front door, and a wooden hoarding along the side wall where the Assize calendar had been pasted up on the Monday. On the list, low down, in a black hand, were the two names the county had come to hear. Levi Harwood, labourer, Send. James Jones, labourer, London. Above them, in a slightly larger hand, ran the words for the murder of the Reverend George Edward Hollis of Frimley, and against those words no reader on the pavement needed a further explanation. Let us go in. The public gallery had been full for an hour by the time the judge took his seat. I would not have wanted you sitting in that gallery. It was 2 rows deep, timber, unbenched, and it ran along the back wall above the well of the court. Men stood at the rail 3 abreast, and a woman here and there stood among them, and the smell of 100 bodies pressed close was one of the smells of English justice in that year that nobody who has not been in such a room can quite imagine. Down on the floor of the court, in front of the judge's dais, was the well itself. Counsel sat there in their gowns and wigs, at a long table stacked with briefs. The clerk sat to one side, with the file of witness statements at his elbow. And behind the well, raised a foot or so above the floor, stood the dock. There are 2 things I have to be honest with you about, before we go further. The record of what was said in that courtroom, over the 2 days it sat, is not as full as we might wish. There is a shorthand report in the Assize papers, and there is a longer report in the county newspaper for the following week, and between the 2 you can put together the shape of the case fairly clearly. What you cannot put together is the tone of every voice, and you cannot put together every silence, and you cannot tell, from a printed page, whether the man in the dock looked at the woman giving evidence against him or looked at the floor. So where I tell you what a witness said, I am on firm ground. Where I tell you what a witness felt, I am guessing, and I will try not to do it more than the story fairly demands. The judge was Mr. Baron Platt, of the Court of Exchequer, a man of about 60 years, dry in his manner, said by those who practised before him to be fair and to be quick. He came in on the strike of 9. Everyone in the well rose. Everyone in the gallery rose. The 2 men in the dock were told, by a nudge from the warder behind them, to rise as well. And the clerk of arraigns, in the flat voice such a clerk keeps for such a purpose, read the indictment aloud. That the said Levi Harwood and the said James Jones, on the 27th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1850, in the parish of Frimley in the said county, feloniously and of their malice aforethought, did shoot and mortally wound George Edward Hollis, clerk in holy orders, of which said mortal wound the said George Edward Hollis did on the 2nd day of October their next ensuing die. How say you, Levi Harwood, are you guilty or not guilty? Not guilty, my lord. How say you, James Jones? Not guilty, my lord. The 2 answers, so far as the newspaper reported them, came without a pause and without a tremor. Whatever else the pair of them had lost by the middle of March, they had not lost the trick of saying 2 plain words in front of a court. The case for the Crown was opened by Mr. Bodkin, senior counsel on the Home Circuit. He was a man not given to display. He spoke for something under half an hour. He told the jury what they were about to hear, and he told them, in the level tone of a man who has made a great many such openings, that the evidence in the case would be of 3 kinds. There would be evidence of the taking, that is, of the plate, the coat, the pistol, the snuff-box, the calfskin purse. There would be evidence of the connection of the 2 prisoners to those items, in the days after the shooting. And there would be, most gravely, the deposition of the wounded man himself, sworn before Sir Edward Coleridge on the afternoon of the 27th of September, at a moment when the deponent had believed himself to be dying, and now to be read aloud in the ordinary manner allowed by law. Come outside the courtroom with me for a moment, before the first witness is called, because Caroline Hollis is walking up the marketplace from the Sun Inn, and I would like her to have a moment to herself before she has to go into that room. She was in her 48th year that spring. She had put on mourning in October, and had not put it off. She had come up to Kingston the evening before with the younger of the 2 curates from the parish beside Frimley, and she had spent the night at the Sun, and she had eaten almost nothing at breakfast. What she wore into the court is not recorded, only that it was black, and that a veil was pinned into her bonnet, and that she did not raise the veil at any point during the 2 days she sat within sight of the men who had shot her husband. She was not called first. She was called on the second day, but she was in the courtroom, in a seat below the gallery kept for her by the sheriff's officer, from the moment the judge took the bench, and she sat where the prisoners could see her, and she did not once look at them. The first witness was Superintendent Biddlecombe of the Guildford Borough Force. He took the oath, and he set his hat under the box, and he told the court, in the plain way he had, what he had done between the afternoon of the 27th of September and the evening of the 8th of October. He named the receiver in Guildford. He named the pawnbroker in Cable Street. He named the man in Bermondsey who had lent out the pistol. He did not stray beyond what he had done and what he had seen. He was in the box for the better part of an hour, and by the end of it, the plate and the coat and the pistol and the snuff-box had been produced on a table in front of the jury, and each item had been marked in his own hand, and each item had been sworn to as the thing he had recovered on the day and at the address he had given. The landlord's wife from the wheat sheaf came next. She was a slight woman, plainly dressed, and she gave her evidence in a country voice that made 1 or 2 of the jurymen lean forward. She told the court about the coat that had been too large at the wrists. She told them about the calfskin purse with the silver clasp. She was asked, by Mr. Bodkin, if she could see in the courtroom any of the men she had served that evening at the wheat sheaf. She looked, without hurry, along the well of the court, and she raised her hand, and she pointed at the dock, and she said, "That one, the one on the left, in the dark coat." The one on the left was Levi. He did not look up. The receiver and the pawnbroker and the man from Bermondsey were each called in their turn. None of them spoke for long. The man from Bermondsey was asked, by counsel for Jones, whether he had known what use the pistol was to be put to when he had handed it over. He said, without any colour in his voice, that he had not, and that he would not have handed it over if he had. Counsel for Jones did not press him. There was nothing to be gained. The morning of the second day belonged to Caroline. She was called at 10, and she walked from her seat to the witness box across the well of the court, with her hand on the arm of the curate, and she was sworn on a small, black-bound testament that had belonged to her husband and that she had brought with her from Frimley. She raised her veil to take the oath, and she did not lower it again while she spoke. Mr. Bodkin led her through her evidence with a courtesy that the newspaper particularly remarked on. She named the plate, item by item, as it lay on the table before the jury. She named the coat. She named the snuff-box. She named the calfskin purse, which had been her husband's since his ordination. She was asked, at the end, whether she had been present at any part of the taking of the deposition on the afternoon of the 27th. She said, in a steady voice, that she had been present throughout. She was asked, on cross-examination, only 2 questions, and both were put with care, and she answered both without hesitation, and she was helped down from the box by the sheriff's officer, and she walked back to her seat, and she sat down, and only then did the hand on her lap begin to tremble. Sir Edward Coleridge was called after her. He rose from the counsel's bench, where he had sat all morning as a magistrate of the county rather than as an advocate, and he took his place in the box. The clerk brought forward the deposition. Sir Edward read it aloud himself, at the direction of Mr. Baron Platt, in the same measured voice he had used to take it down at the bedside on the Friday afternoon. It was not a long document. It ran to under 2 sheets of foolscap in his own hand. It was, from the first word to the last, the voice of the dead man. "I believe," said the deposition through Sir Edward's mouth, "that I shall not recover of the wound now upon me." There were 3 of them upon the stair. One held a candle. One held a pistol at his belt. And the room, for the length of the reading, was as still a room as any I have described to you in this history. There is an old phrase for it in the law courts. They called it the silence of the dying oath, and it fell upon the courtroom at Kingston on that Thursday morning as the dead parson spoke through Sir Edward's voice, and it did not lift until the last word of the deposition had been read and Sir Edward had set the papers down. The defence, when it came, was thin. Counsel for Levi rose and argued, in the manner such counsel had to argue in such a case, that the identification of his client depended on a coat and a purse, and that a labourer might come by such things, in the taprooms of the Heath in that autumn, by more paths than the one the Crown had laid out. It was a thing to be said. It was not a thing to be believed, and the jurymen did not believe it. Counsel for Jones argued that his client had been 60 miles east of Frimley by the Sunday morning, and that a man in London could not be shown to have fired a pistol in Surrey. He too said what had to be said. The pistol Jones had been carrying in the room over the chandler's shop on the Wednesday of the following week was the pistol from Bermondsey, and the pistol from Bermondsey was the pistol on the table in front of the jury, and the jury had heard the man from Bermondsey swear to it. Mr. Baron Platt summed up shortly, in the last hour of the afternoon. The exact words of the summing up are lost, or nearly so. The shorthand reporter marked only the headings of it in his book, and the newspaper the following week gave a paraphrase that ran to a paragraph and no more. What can be said is that he directed the jury on the weight of the deposition, and he directed them on the law of common purpose in a felony, and he told them that if they were satisfied the two prisoners had gone to the vicarage together with the intent to break in, then the hand that had fired the pistol was, in law, the hand of both. He gave them the case at 5:15. They came back at 5:45. The clerk of arraigns rose. "Gentlemen of the jury, are you agreed upon your verdict?" "We are." "How say you? Is the prisoner Levi Harwood guilty or not guilty of the wilful murder of George Edward Hollest?" "Guilty, my lord." "And the prisoner, James Jones?" "Guilty, my lord." Mr. Baron Platt did not speak at once. He let the words hang a moment in the courtroom. Then he asked the two men in the dock whether they had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon them according to the law. Levi shook his head. Jones said, very low, that he had not shot the parson. It was the only sentence, so far as the newspaper reported, that he spoke on either day of the trial. The judge did not reply to him. The clerk placed the square of black silk on the top of the judge's wig, and Mr. Baron Platt, in the form of words that had not much changed in 100 years, sentenced Levi Harwood and James Jones to be taken from the place where they then stood to the place from which they came, and thence to a place of lawful execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until their bodies were dead, and thereafter to be buried within the precincts of the gaol. And may the Lord have mercy on your souls. They were taken down. The court rose. Caroline sat a long moment in her place, with the curate's hand on hers, and then she stood, and she walked out of the courtroom without looking at the dock, and she went back to the Sun Inn, and she left Kingston that evening for Frimley in a hired carriage, and she was home at the vicarage before midnight. And the two men, that same night, were put into a closed van under an escort of 6 constables, and they were driven the 12 miles east through the dark, along the Wandsworth Road and over the river, to a gaol on the south bank of the Thames, where a scaffold had already been ordered up for the 3rd week of April, and where a crowd was even now beginning, in the way such a crowd began in that country in that year, to plan its journey to the wall. The candle burned low. Come with me, then, out of the courtroom at Kingston, and along the road east under a moon 3 days off the full. We will not travel by the closed van tonight. The two men have been driven ahead of us, and by the time we cross the river at Wandsworth, they are already inside the walls of a gaol on the south bank, in a cell each, on a corridor kept apart from the ordinary prisoners for the use of men under sentence of death. We are going to the same building because the last of this history is written on a scaffold there, and it will be over before the 3rd week of April. But I would like the 12 miles between us and it to be walked, if you will bear with me for a paragraph or two, because there is nothing at the other end that a listener will be glad to reach in any hurry. Horsemonger Lane Gaol stood behind a wall in the parish of Newington, in a district of the city known then as the Borough. It had been raised at the tail of the previous century, of yellow stock brick, in a square with an open yard at the centre, and it held about 300 prisoners on the ordinary side and no more than half a dozen on what the warders called the condemned side. That corridor was reached by a stair off the governor's own passage. It was not a place the governor visited often. The men on it were fed by a warder who did nothing else, and were prayed with by a chaplain who did nothing else, and were let out for an hour each afternoon into a yard the width of a cart. From the day sentence was passed, they had 3 Sundays to live. Levi Harwood, on the record of the Gaol chaplain, made no confession of any kind during those 3 weeks. He asked for tobacco, and it was refused him under the standing order of the sheriff. He asked for a testament, and it was given him, and the chaplain sat with him for an hour of every day, and read aloud, and Levi listened without answering. On the last Sunday of his life he took the sacrament, and he wept once during it, and he ate the meal that was brought him that evening, and he lay down on the plank that served him for a bed, and he slept until the warder woke him at 4 in the morning. James Jones, in the cell across the passage, was harder for the chaplain to reach. He wrote a letter on the Thursday before the hanging, and he had it sent out to his mother in a court off the Ratcliffe Highway, and the letter has not survived. What the chaplain reported afterwards was that Jones held, up to the last morning, that the pistol had gone off in his hand, and not by his intent, and that he had not meant, when they set out from the beer shop, that any man in the vicarage should die. Whether that was the truth of the thing, or the last handhold of a frightened labourer of 29 years, the record does not decide, and I will not decide it here either. The day fixed for the execution was Tuesday, the 15th of April, in the year 1851. The scaffold at Horsemonger Lane was not raised in a yard. It was set up on the flat lid roof above the main gate, so that the drop faced the street, and so that the crowd in the street could see it without a wall between them. That fact matters, because a crowd came for it. By the middle of the Monday afternoon, the lane outside the Gaol was already filling with men and women who meant to keep their places overnight, and by dawn on the Tuesday the whole street was standing, and the neighbouring roofs were let out to spectators by the hour, and the tap rooms of the borough had been open since 3 in the morning, and were doing the trade of a fair. I want to leave the crowd for a moment, because I do not think the crowd is where you and I should stand for this. Come with me instead round to the back of the Gaol, into the passage where the 2 men are being brought out of their cells. It is a little after 7 o'clock. The sky over the roofs of Newington is the pale, washed grey of an English April, and there is a wind coming up from the river that carries the smell of the malt houses on Bankside. Levi is brought out first. His hands are tied in front of him with a strip of soft cord, and a warder walks at each of his elbows. He does not speak. The chaplain walks a pace behind, reading the office for the burial of the dead in the low, steady voice such chaplains kept for such walks. Jones is brought out after him. He also does not speak. The 2 of them are taken along the passage, and up a narrow flight of stone stairs, and out onto the leads above the gate. There is a thing I have to admit here, because the accounts of that morning are not all in agreement, and I would rather you had both of them than only one. The newspapers of the following week reported that Levi went to the drop with his head up, and that Jones went with his head down, and that neither man spoke a word after the chaplain finished the office. The Gaol chaplain, in the private note he made in his own book that evening, remembered it a little differently. He remembered that Jones did speak at the very last, and that he said only, "Forgive me," and that he did not name the person from whom the forgiveness was asked. Whether he meant his mother, or the parson, or the God the chaplain had been reading to him about for 3 weeks, or all 3 at once, is one of the things that has not come down to us and is not going to. I mention it because it is the sort of half-record a real history is full of, and because a man who says "forgive me" on a scaffold at the age of 29 deserves the sentence set down beside his name rather than lost. The hangman that morning was William Calcraft, of the parish of Hackney, who by the spring of 1851 had been in the office some 22 years, and who would hold it for another 20. He did not speak to the 2 men. He drew the caps down over their faces. He set the ropes at the angle he had used for a great many mornings before this one, and he stepped back to the lever, and at a nod from the under-sheriff he drew it, and the trap fell, and the crowd in the street below made the one great sound such crowds always made, and then went very still. The bell of the parish of St. Mary Newington began to toll. It was 8:10 in the morning. The bodies were left hanging the hour the law required, and were then taken down, and were carried inside the wall of the gaol, and were buried, before the middle of the afternoon, in unmarked graves within the precincts of the prison, as the sentence had said they should be. Let me take you now, if you will come, out of the borough and back into Surrey, because we have one more journey to make in this story, and it is the one that matters most. Frimley in the middle of April was greener than it had been when we first stood in its lane in September. The hedges were coming into leaf along the road from Guildford, and the plantation behind the vicarage was full of the noise of rooks nesting, and the yews in the churchyard, which do not change with the season, stood where they had always stood, over the graves the reverend had opened for his parishioners across the 20-odd years of his living. Caroline had not gone up to London for the hanging. There is no note in any parish paper that she left the vicarage that week at all. She sat in the front parlour on the Tuesday morning with the curate from the neighbouring parish, and she heard the news, when it came in the early afternoon by a messenger from Guildford, without speaking, and she asked the curate to read the office for the dead, and he read it, and she did not weep at any point during it. The parish had buried the reverend himself in the October of the previous year, 4 days after the shooting. His grave lay a few yards to the south of the porch, in a plot Caroline had chosen, so that it stood in line with the graves of the 2 curates who had died in the living before him. The stone that was set over him in the following spring was cut in a plain style, at Caroline's instruction. It gave his name, and his years, and his office. It gave the date of his birth, and the date of his death, and the manner of it in one short line, killed by burglars at his own door. It gave nothing else. There was no verse of scripture, and no line of poetry, and no motto. She did not want, she told the stonemason, any word on the stone that might invite a passer-by to pause and consider. She wanted only the fact. I have stood in that churchyard. It is easy to find. It is not a large place, and the yews are still there, and the porch is the same porch he came out of on the last Sunday of his life, and the stone is still upright, and the letters on it are still legible if you look. It is the plainest stone in the row, and it is the plainest because the woman who ordered it had lost the appetite for any word that was not strictly required. That is not a thing you would guess from a photograph. It is a thing you feel when you are there. The vicarage itself was given up before the end of the year. A living cannot be held by a widow, and the new incumbent was appointed at Michaelmas of 1851, and Caroline moved out in the September of that year with the 2 spaniels and a cart of her own furniture, and she went to live with a married sister in a village near Basingstoke. She survived her husband by 23 years. The parish register at Frimley records that she was brought back once, in the spring of 1868, to attend the funeral of the sexton who had been in office in her husband's time, and that she stood by the grave for a few minutes with her hand on the sexton's widow's arm, and that she then went away in the same carriage that had brought her, and did not return to the village again. She was buried, in the year 1874, in the churchyard at Basingstoke, and not beside her husband, and I have wondered why. I have not worked it out. The record does not say. Samuel Harwood, whom we have not spoken of since the courtroom, went home to the parish of Send in the June of 1851 on a verdict of not guilty in the murder charge, having been permitted to give evidence for the Crown against his cousin. He was tried at the same Assize for the burglary, and he was found guilty of that, and he was sentenced to 15 years' transportation, and he sailed out of Portsmouth in the July of the following year for the colony of Van Diemen's Land. What became of him, there is another one of the things this history does not follow. There is a Samuel Harwood on the muster roll of a work gang near Hobart in the year 1855, and there is a Samuel Harwood buried in a Presbyterian churchyard outside the same town in the year 1869, and it may be that they are the same man, and it may be that they are not. The record does not settle it, and I do not think at this distance that it needs to be settled. The vicarage at Frimley stood for another 60 years. It was pulled down in the early part of the last century, when the parish built itself a smaller house for its parson, and the yews in the garden went with it, and the study window where the reverend had blown out his candle on the last night of his life is not anywhere now. The lane is a road. The heath is smaller than it was. The beer shop where three men sat over a table with the wet still on their coats has been a private cottage for many years, and its occupants know the name of the house, and most of them do not know the story that gave it the name. And so the parish of Frimley in the county of Surrey, in the middle of a long English century, closed over the death of the Reverend George Edward Hollist, as parishes close over most of the deaths that happen in them. The bell was rung. The stone was cut. The widow moved away. The men who had done the thing were hanged behind a wall in the borough, and were buried inside the same wall, and no stone was cut for them at all. If you are still with me, I would like you to let the room around you soften now. The bell above the porch has stopped. The rooks have gone up out of the yews for the last time this evening. The candle on the writing desk in the study is guttering in its socket, and there is no one at the desk any longer to trim the wick. Somewhere along the road from Guildford, the last farm cart is turning in for the night. The rain has moved on across the heath toward Bagshot, and the wet gravel of the drive is beginning to dry under a wind out of the north. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.